Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Jaime Cortez about Gordo. It's a collection of short stories. Welcome, Jaime.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Same here. So Jaime Cortez is a graphic novelist, a visual artist, a writer, a teacher, and an occasional performer. Cortez has historically used art and humor to explore sexuality, social justice, HIV and AIDS, and the Chicano identity. So Jaime, tell the audience why the book sort of revolves around Watsonville, California.
I think I went by the kind of classic recommendation that they often give fiction writers, which is write what you know. And Watsonville is one of my hometowns. I say it's one of my hometowns because I lived in two places as a child for extended periods, and Watsonville is one of them. It's also where I currently live. After living in a lot of different places around the country, I have come back to Watsonville, and I was very much excited to write about my hometown. I remember when I was a high schooler and we read John Steinbeck's book. As you can imagine, here in this area, so close to the Salinas Valley, John Steinbeck's books are very important in school curriculum. We read it, and I remember just thinking, wow, like somebody wrote about a place that I drive past with my family on the regular, and that these places actually matter enough that someone wanted to write these stories about them. And it's something that just stuck with me for so many years. And when it came my turn to start writing my own stories, I definitely wanted to do a similar thing and really kind of recognize these stories. And also just, again, because it's home, it's familiar to me, it's what I know intimately. And it's a place where, you know, writing about your hometown and your life experiences is a place where you have ultimate authority, right? I know my life better than anybody else. So, and I know, you know, to whatever degree that I understand my community, I understand it. So I think it was just that, having had that early inspiration from Steinbeck's books, and then also just writing what I know and also what I love. I love this area of the state.
So Steinbeck's a pretty good goal to aspire to. I loved reading Steinbeck when I was in high school. Steinbeck figured in pretty much to our curriculum as well. And I guess probably because I grew up in a more rural country setting in eastern North Carolina where there were a lot of farmers. And I know there's a lot of farming around Watsonville as well. Did you grow up farming or were you farming adjacent? I was farming adjacent. So I had relatives that were farmers, but I did not grow up on a farm. What about you?
We were definitely in the kind of agricultural labor world. My parents were farm workers, and we worked and I say we because back then it was very customary, especially during the summers, for entire families to go out and do certain kinds of labor, especially harvesting. So as a child, I worked with my parents, and you know, by the time I was 12, I had experience, you know, picking potatoes and cucumbers and pulling onions and chopping garlic and picking plums and apples and pears, just that whole range, and eventually strawberries, which is probably the thing I did the most growing up, especially as the strawberry industry really expanded in the Watsonville area. But we were more than adjacent. We were in it. That was, you know, our livelihood, and it was something that we did intergenerationally, and it's an experience that you know, for a little kid, doing farm labor is not fun. However, I'm really glad I had that experience. The learning that came from it and the perspective it gives you as a kid, to have that experience of contributing to the family's, you know, finances, and also to just understand what it takes to earn a dollar as a little kid. It's a very important life lesson.
And I think we also learn a bit about nature as well. You know, when you're farming, I did two summers in tobacco, and you know
Okay.
it would be so bloody hot. I mean, it was excruciatingly hot, and you would pray for a rainstorm, and the rainstorm would temporarily cool you off, but after the rainstorm, it was hotter than it was before because now it's humid and hot. And it's one of those things, you know, you learn to respect nature. You realize, you know, if it rains too much, the crops may be injured or what have you. And it's one of those things that it was a great life lesson about nature and nature's both restorativeness and its destruction, if you know, depends on which way nature goes, and we've absolutely no control over it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. The kind of variety of lessons that you learn are just, it's endless, really. Just also things like, for us, um, the idea of like vegetables in a supermarket, we understood that those do not just magically appear there, even as very little kids. We understood like, oh, somebody was doing stoop labor to pick these potatoes up. Somebody was climbing up trees to get these apples, and just we understood it in such a concrete way. And even, yeah, I think I'm just so glad for those lessons.
So I do want to highlight again the title of the book is Gordo. And I remember the first time I heard someone refer to someone else as Gordo, I lived in Miami, and I knew what the word meant. And I remember saying to the person the word was used for, oh, these would be fighting words because I've had body issues my entire life and I've always been heavier. And so being called Gordo was like fighting words, even though I'm not a fighter. But I gather in the Latin community, that is often much more of a term of endearment. Is that correct?
It can be everything. Gordo. I mean, if you live in the South, you understand what it means to say something with kind intention, or say something that sounds kind but is not meant kindly. It can be all of that. But Gordo is a very, very common nickname for little boys. Usually, little girls don't get named that way, but little boys who are chubby or fat, um, it is so common for a kid to get that nickname of Gordo. and and yes, there can be a lot of love in that. I think that one of the things that's interesting is that, especially if you add the diminutive ito at the end, gordito, that's like pure tenderness.
Yes.
This is my little chubby kid, and it's a lot of tenderness in that. And of course, it can also be really hurtful. Gordo,
Right.
it can be a slap in the face. Just depends on the context. But yeah, nicknames are very prevalent throughout my book, and it's just a reflection of just the culture I grew up in, where everybody it seemed had a nickname, and in some cases, you don't even know a person's real name. You only knew them by their nickname. So that was a very common thing, and so I'm fascinated by nicknames. I'm fascinated by the way that in a family or community, when you are given a nickname, it is this embrace in some ways. It's saying, we know you with this intimacy, and so we can call you by this special name. So it's belonging, but it's double edged because it's
Yeah.
also, you don't get to choose your nickname. If they call you Fatty, that's it. Yeah, that's going to be your nickname. If you're Flaco, Skinny Bones, that's it. That's going to be, you don't get to choose it. And in some ways, the family or community group is like saying, well, you belong with us, but you also belong to us. So we get to decide what your name is, not you. So there's this kind of a double-edged thing.
I, I think so too, because I think sometimes the belonging is something that all humans want to have. We all want to belong somewhere. And I think that when you're given a nickname, it is a double edged sword. My mother's sister, that was closest to her in age, her nickname was Skinny, and she was anything but. But as a child, she was really, really thin. As an adult, she was really heavy. And so it was almost a joke when people referred to her by her nickname. And there were people who never knew what her real name was, ever,
Yes,
because
yeah,
somebody had called her that her entire life.
yes.
So
And
that
this
was,
is
oh, sorry, go
this,
ahead.
this is something that's so true cross-culturally. Like I've had so many different friends. Oh God, Filipino people are just the same with the nicknames. Italian people are just the same with the nicknames. and it's just a funny conversation that I enjoy having with a lot of people about the function of nicknames.
And I agree with you. Sometimes it's inclusivity and sometimes it's ownership. That's always one of those things you're not really sure which it is. So I do want to talk about a couple of the short stories. I want to talk about the Pardos first. And here nicknames figure in really heavy into that story. And later on we find out that one of the other characters doesn't realize someone is who they are because they don't know their name. So, in reading the Pardos, one of the things that I was struck by was a realization of some kids I grew up with who were similar to the Pardos, but in a way that may not, if somebody else read this story, they may not pick up on this. I felt there was so much food insecurity within this story, just watching the kids eat. And I realized that, that's a term that we hear a lot about, food insecurity, but I don't think the average person understands what food insecurity is. Was that something you meant to weave in there, or is that something Dan dreamed about?
I did. It's this kind of irony, like this immigrant family is living in the midst of this immense agricultural, industrialized agriculture region in coastal California, right? It's massive scale farming, lettuce, strawberries, artichokes, you name it. It's done at a big scale. And in the midst of all that, there is also just, the issue of some families just not having enough food. And you see that in the boys when they go to have the school lunch. I remember, the school lunch, and, some kid would be turning up their nose at the school lunch. Oh, I don't like that. But some kids were coming in hungry, and it meant the world to have a hot breakfast or a hot lunch or both. And I kind of wanted to reflect that. I also just, for me, with one of the things with the Pardos is just the idea that, these kids are coming into school sometimes and they're carrying so much trauma and they're so stressed out and they're acting out in different ways. And there's reasons behind it. When we talk about the quote, the bad kids or the bad family, there's this whole we're seeing the tip of that proverbial iceberg, and underneath that, there's all these other things that are happening to them that are really pretty devastating. And God bless teachers for trying to help when they see kids who they can tell are going through some serious trauma and hardship. But I think that was reflected, and you saw that when it was school lunchtime, the Pardo boys would wipe their plates clean, and if there was more, they would ask for seconds.
Yes, and I remember so I'm old enough that we actually had cafeteria workers, not just pizza delivery people. So we had people who actually made the meals that we ate. And there were kids who would go back for seconds. And I remember some kids being made fun of because they wanted seconds. Now, as an adult, I realized that, the children were simply hungry. And there was always someone in the cafeteria who recognized they were hungry. And I remember there was an older woman who used to say, "Oh, I'm so glad you like my cooking." It was her way of connecting with the kids without calling them out that you want seconds. But they were like, "Oh, I just love the fact that you like my food, and I'm glad you came back for more." And God
Yeah.
bless people like that see something that someone needs.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too and part of that too was that in that particular scenario, the Pardo family, they don't have a mom in the house. She's gone. She's dead. And I think there was something about that emotional but also literal nourishment, that mothers will do almost anything to make sure that their kids have that nourishment that they need. And in this case, the father was, I think, not someone who was that invested either way. Um, but I think it also had to do with just that lack of a caring figure, because the father was a very kind of brutal person who came out of a lot of Civil War trauma from Central America, and he was carrying that with him. So I think there was also that piece. Like in some ways, it was almost like uh, in a small way, it was like moms in the cafeteria.
I agree. They provide nourishment, and of course, you've hit on a subject too that, trauma is something that affects a lot of people. Some of us are fortunate that we skate by trauma. I mean, trauma doesn't affect every person, but for those it affects, the 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 effects of that trauma are really, really enormous. And oftentimes, not everyone is equipped to deal with people who face trauma. If you face trauma as a child, you're not equipped to deal with it either, because trauma is typically something that adults have rained down on the children. And that's a tough thing to go through. And, we hope we're good people and we, keep an eye out and try to have a sympathetic heart, but it's not always easy. And especially when it's not your child.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I did feel like, especially in so many of your short stories, you give us a community, which is really important. We see the community in very different forms. There's sometimes some of the kids are bullied, and you talk about that so directly. And then we see what happens with some of them. I love the fact that so many of your stories have an interconnectivity with each other.
Yeah, I kind of it was interesting because I've often said in discussions about my book, I talk about how I feel like I never wrote a book. And by that, I mean that I had a short story mentality. Okay, I'm going to write one short story. Okay, that was fun. Let's do another one. That was great. Let's do another one. And it was only like after I had a stack of these short stories and a skilled, kind of more seasoned editor and author both would look at these and they would say, oh, this is a collection. This is a book. And have you considered creating more connective tissue between these stories, because they're almost already there? And I thought, okay, well, let's do that. And that was a lot of fun to create that connective tissue between the stories. So we get to see some of the characters at different points in their life, as kids and then later as young adults. And it wasn't the original intention, but that is how it played out. And it was it was almost more of a novelistic approach where you try to track these characters across time. And it was not my original intention, but I'm glad I got that experience. Of doing that, tracking.
Well, and I'm glad you found the strings to weave between the stories, because it makes it, not only the stories are great, but it also gives it an extra dimension when you see, because in real life, there are days where you run into someone on the street, you go in grocery shopping and you run into one of your neighbors and you think, oh, I didn't know I would see you here. That actually happened to me recently. I ran into someone I didn't even know lived in my neighborhood, someone I've known for years, but I thought he lived in a different part of town, and I ran into him at the grocery store 2 days ago. And it is just those little things that happen in everyday real life where we run into people we know in places that maybe we wouldn't think they would be there. And so that was fun. So let's talk about Raymundo, the problem of style. I love Raymundo. So give the audience a little idea of who Raymundo is.
I'll tell you that Raimundo is a character that appears in two of the stories. And he's based on an actual person that I remember from when I was growing up here in Watsonville. And he was I think used to be referred to as like the town fruit, like the one person in town who was identifiable as a queer person. And that person actually lived just a few houses away from me. And I was a little boy, and they were already a young adult. And they terrified me. That person, he terrified me because he was so different. And I just couldn't imagine, what does it mean to be so different, where everyone points at you and everyone is constantly identifying you as different. All I wanted as a little boy was to belong and to fit in and to be accepted. And it was terrifying to me that someone would, at that point, he was wearing his hair down to his waist, and just being very kind of flamboyant that way. I just couldn't fathom that. And so I kind of went back to my intrigue of that and thought about the little stories and snippets that I knew about this person, who had become a community, a hairdresser in the community, and a beloved one at that. He did a really wonderful job, and he had a lot of friendships that way over time. But those earlier years were much harder. And so I kind of wanted to take this person who I had seen from a distance and kind of get a little more intimate with this character and imagine them as an adolescent, and then later as a young adult, um, and to think about what it means um, to be an insider outsider in your community, where everyone knows you, they identify you instantly, and you kind of are known and belong in that capacity, and you have a role. You're the, in this case, he was the hairdresser, but he's also on the outside. Like, what is this person? Why is he like this? Why is he so different? Why does he have to quote flaunt it? So I was very interested in exploring that, like what it means to carve out a place for yourself that is so contested and complex, that role of the insider outsider. What does it mean to carve out that place for yourself? And how does humor help you survive through those things? And also, how does being of service to others open up a place for you to belong? In this case, in his work as a hairdresser, the person who does people's hair for their weddings or for their quinceañera, the big celebration that they do when a girl turns 15. Those are days when hair becomes very important because you want to look extra special, and he's the guy who can help you on that special day. And so I was interested in all that, and as I kind of wrote the story, I thought, wow, I was so afraid and kind of repulsed by how different he was back then. But then looking back at it as an adult, I thought, wow, what courage! What courage to just be yourself when there's, this was in the 70s, and there was, in a little farm town, there was no structures of support for this person. They just toughed it out on their own as the lone kind of out queer person. And it touched my heart to imagine the kind of day-to-day courage it probably took for him to just be himself.
I surely recognized Raymundo's childhood, because while I was not physically accosted, everything that happened to Raymundo happened to me. And so I really could see this direct connection to this kid's soul, because everyone else seemed to know or label what they wanted to about me long before I even knew who I was. And I think, kids just pick things out so easily. Kids see so much better than adults do. Kids often know who to not go around because they're afraid of them. But when you're in a school situation, you really cannot get away from the bully. And I remember there's a passage in telling Raymundo's story where, he was afraid to go to the bathroom. I spent 4 years of high school never going to the bathroom because I was petrified. Yeah, I was petrified. Or I would sneak into the teacher's bathroom and occasionally would get called and told I couldn't do it. But I couldn't go to the regular kids' bathroom because I would be bullied relentlessly. And it's something that I think as an adult, I never assume someone thinks I'm straight, because I'm not. And, so nowadays, God help you if you try to bully me, because it will not end well for the other person. So I really loved Raymundo, and I love to see him as an adult as well, because all of a sudden you see this person who has said, you know what? You want to call me a fruit? I'm going to claim it. I'll be a strawberry or whatever today's fruit is. I don't give a damn about what you think.
Yeah. And there's a part in that story where, he's a hairdresser. He's very good at his job, and he has a very loyal following. He's a very busy hairdresser. And his coworker, asked him, "You're so good at hair. Have you ever thought of going up to San Francisco?" Which is, 100 miles away, but it might as well be another country for all intents and purposes. Have you ever thought of going up to San Francisco? And he talks about, no, he goes, I have spent my life fighting to find my place in this community. And I belong here, and I'm staying here. And that was something that was important for me to just acknowledge, that we can make home in the prickly bosom of our hometown that way. So just as we can sometimes in contested family relationships, right? When sometimes in our queerness, we can have these really complex, difficult, prickly family relationships, and somehow we find a way to still make home there. So, yeah.
Yes, and there's a little saying that sounds a lot cuter than it really is, but bloom where you're planted. I mean, I think that if we're able to bloom where we're planted, we have a happy life. It's not always easy. That's not to say that there's not a lot of manure slung. Look at all these planting references, but but truly, if you can find a way to make a home for yourself, whether that's your original home or whatever home, you do have a happy life with a home. It's just the way life works.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So once again, the book is called Gordo and it's by Jaime Cortez. Jaime, this was just such a fun read, and I think it should be recommended to all schools.
Oh, thank you. And I did try to make it fun. I really, really tried to stay connected to the fact that, like, I grew up, in these situations that I did, and there was certain hardships there, as there are for everybody. Everybody goes through hardships. But what was also always there was the humor, and that's how we got through. And that's a big part of this book, is just that it comes together: the heartache, the pain, the sadness, and the laughter. It's all together. So
it's part of life.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure to share it with readers.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Jaime, do you have a website or social media you would like to share with the audience?
Yes, my website is www.jaimecortez.org. And Jaime is spelled Jaime.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.